What's up guys? In this video tutorial I'm going to be teaching you how to make a side menu for iOS devices using Swift 4. So before we get started, I'm going to do a quick demo. We're going to click on this hamburger menu button. We'll get presented with our side menu. We then click on an option. It dismisses the menu and then we get presented with a new view controller, which is a pretty common action that you'll see linked to actions in apps that use side menus. Now before we jump into Xcode and start coding, I want to note that I don't use storyboards. I actually construct all of my views programmatically. There's a lot of advantages to it. You'll see it a lot in the professional world. And that's what we're going to be doing here. So let's go ahead and get started with Xcode now. So go ahead and open up Xcode and hit create a new Xcode project. Single view application, hit next. Name it whatever you want. I'm going to call this side menu tutorial. Next. Hit create. Okay, I gotta get my signing right. Okay guys, and when I start all of my projects, I always start by organizing it into some folders. So go ahead and select new group 4 times. And we'll name these folders in a second. Okay, first one I do is my utilities folder. That's where I put all my constants, protocols, extensions, stuff like that. And the next 3 are just going to be our model, view, and controller folders. Okay, so I always start off by organizing my projects like this. Now, in our controller folder, we're going to go ahead and create 3 files. So select new file, Swift file, and we're going to call this container controller. And do that 2 more times. Swift file, home controller, and then new file, Swift file, menu controller. Okay, so let me full screen this for you guys. Okay, so go to your container controller. We're going to say import UI kit. Say class container controller. UI view controller, and I also do this, create my marks for my properties, my initialization, and my handlers. And again guys, this just organizes your project and your code to make everything more readable. You can go up here and kind of navigate to things a lot easier. So then let's go ahead and write our viewDidLoad method and make sure you call super.viewDidLoad. We can go ahead and copy and paste this and just go ahead and paste it in there. And this is going to be our home controller. And then this is going to be our menu controller. So I'll explain the theory here. So essentially we have this container controller and we are going to be sort of embedding these 2 controllers here, home controller and menu controller, into that container controller. So right now this is the home controller, this is what you see, and then we press this button and then that's the menu controller there. And it makes it a lot easier if you sort of nest your controllers in this way to do this side menu task. So let's go ahead and we can delete this view controller file. So just go ahead and hit delete, move to trash. And now we need to set our root view controller for our application, because if you go ahead and run this, it's not going to open up to any of our view controllers that we have set. We need to do that in our app delegate. So let's go ahead and go to this app delegate and then go to did finish launching with options. See, and now we can say window equals UI window, window.make key invisible, and then window.root view controller. And this is going to be our container controller, guys. So the container controller is the root view controller, and then we will be putting our home controller and menu controller, sort of embedding it in that container controller. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's write this function called configure home controller. Okay, and then we will write another function called configure menu controller. And first we want to do our home controller. So let's go ahead and do that. We are going to say let home controller equal home controller. And it's embedded in a navigation controller. So then we're just going to, I'll just call it controller equals UI navigation controller. And that navigation's root view controller is going to be our home controller. So now we need to write these lines of code out. We're going to say view.add subview, controller.view. Then we're going to say did or add child controller. And make sure you add the controller because we need that to be embedded in the navigation controller. Then we're going to say controller.didMove to parent, and that's going to be self. So we're adding that child controller to our container controller, and then we're saying that that home controller did move to the parent view controller of self, which is our container controller. So let's go to our home controller and see if this is working. So just say view.background color equals .blue. And now let's run our application, and we should see a blue background, and we do not, because we did not call our function. So go back to our container controller, and in our viewDidLoad method, call configure home controller. So in our app loads, it's going to add that home controller, and it's embedded in a navigation controller, so we are looking good. Now let's start configuring out our navigation bar up there. So first thing, we want that white status bar. So we're going to say preferred status bar style, and then we're going to return .light content. And make sure you do that in our container controller because that is our root view controller. Then go back to this home controller. We're going to say that's white. And then we're going to write out a function called configure navigation bar. Okay, so configuring this navigation bar is pretty easy. We just need to say navigation controller dot navigation bar dot bar tint color equals dot dark gray. That gives us that dark gray background. Navigation controller dot navigation bar dot bar style equals dot black. This makes any like text we put in there turn out white. And then we're going to say navigation item dot title equals side menu. Then we need to add our bar button, so we're going to say navigation item dot left bar button item equals UI bar button item. And we want to select this option here, image style target action. And you guys are going to need to import the assets for this project, so just go ahead and download the source code in the description and then get these assets imported into your project. And Swift changed their image literals and they made them awful, so this is how we do it now. You type out image literal and then you double click on the little image literal icon until you find the one you want. And then we're going to say .with rendering mode .always original, and what that does is make sure this always comes out in that white color. And then we're going to say .plain for style, target is self, and our selector is going to be called handle menu toggle. Then we need to create that function, so we're going to say at Objective-C func handle menu toggle, and then for now let's just say print toggle menu, and let's call our function up in our viewDidLoad method, configure navigation bar. So now let's run our project and see how we're looking. It should end up looking just like this now, and that's looking really good, guys. So if we click on this, we should see that message popping up in our console that says toggle menu, and that's looking really good. So now what we want to do is add our menu controller in so that when we hit this button, that view controller moves over and it shows our menu controller here. The tricky part with that is we want that menu controller to get added to our container view controller, not our home controller. So that's where we need to write out the code. So let's go ahead and do that. So go back to our container controller, and what we're going to do is go up to our properties section and create a variable for our menu controller. Just like that. And the reason for this is we only want to add our menu controller one time. We don't want every time we click this button for our project to have to render out that menu controller. So we only want that to happen on the first time we do that. So what we're going to say is in this configure menu controller function now, again, we're in container controller. We're going to say if menu controller equals nil, and then we are going to add our menu controller here. So we're going to say menu controller equals menu controller, just like this. And then we are going to say view.insert subview menu controller at index 0. Then we're going to say add child controller menu controller. What is that? We'll figure that out in a second. Then we'll say menu controller dot did move to parent view controller self. Oh, we need to say menu controller dot view there. Okay, so that's all the code we need to write in order to add our menu controller. And let's go ahead and say print did add menu controller, right? And we're going to see how many times this print statement comes up. And first, we also need to call our this function here. So you'll notice the tricky part about that is our handler for this guy is in our home controller, and the function and where we're adding this menu controller is in our container controller. So we actually need to create a protocol and use a delegate in order to add that menu controller in. So let's go up to our utils folder. And I know it seems complicated, but it's not as bad as it sounds. Create a new file, go to Swift file and hit protocol and type in protocols. So we're going to create a protocol, and it's going to be called home controller delegate. And we're going to add in this function called handle menu toggle. So the toggling for our menu is actually going to be handled by our container controller, not by our home controller. So that we can add that menu controller in, and later on we'll actually be able to present that view controller over our container controller when we do something like click on an option here. So that's why we're going to be using a protocol. So let's go back to our container controller. We're going to create an extension, and this is going to inherit from the protocol we just created. And it's going to ask us to implement those methods. So let's go ahead and do that. And here we are going to add our menu controller, right? So we're going to say configure menu controller. Oops. Okay, so essentially what's going to happen here is now we have to create a delegate in our home controller that is of type home controller delegate, and then in our action handler we are going to say delegate dot handle menu toggle. So essentially we're using this delegate to sort of link these two view controllers together, and that handle menu toggle is that code is going to get executed when we hit that button in our home controller. So basically our code is going to go back over here, and it's going to say look for this method, and then it's going to execute this line of code here, which is our configure menu controller. So let's see if that works. So we should get a message saying that it did add the menu controller, and that should only pop up once, right? So let's see, when I hit that, oh, we didn't set our delegate. We need to actually set that delegate variable, right? So we do that when we configure our home controller. So what we need to do is say home controller.delegate equals self, and we say self because this is the file that is conforming to that protocol down here. So now when we run that, it should work. It's a common mistake a lot of people make. Okay, so now we hit this. Oop, wrong one. Sorry, guys. Okay, now you notice I pressed that button and it said did add menu controller. So we've added our menu controller, and we notice that when we press it again, that message doesn't pop up because menu controller is no longer equal to nil. So that's looking good there, guys. Now what we need to do is actually make it so that our controller moves over and shows that menu controller, and then we need to start configuring out our menu controller. So let's go ahead and get started with that. Okay, so we can actually go ahead and delete this line of code. Now we need to write out a function to show our menu controller. And again, make sure you're writing this function in our container controller. So we're going to say func show menu controller. And we need to pass in a parameter called should expand, which is going to be a Boolean variable. And this is going to help us determine whether or not we're showing the menu or hiding the menu. So say if should expand, then we're going to say show menu, else hide menu. Okay, and now all we have to do is write out a animation function in order to animate that center controller over to the right. So we're going to say UIView.animate, start typing out animate spring, and hit enter. We're going to say 0.3 for the duration, 0 for the delay, 0.8 for the spring with damping, initial spring velocity 0, options are .curve ease in out. Animations, go here and hit enter. And then we're not going to be using the completion right now, but we will revisit that later. And for our animations, essentially what we want to do is slide this home controller over, right? So we actually need access to that home controller as like a class level variable. So we're going to go back up to the top in our property section, and we're going to create a variable called center controller, which is essentially the controller that is being shown on top of the container controller. And it's going to be a UIView controller, or of type UIView controller. And then we're going to go back down to this function here, configure home controller, right? And we're just going to say that this controller that we set equal to the navigation controller is equal to our center controller. So now let's change that elsewhere. Center controller.view, center controller.didMove. Right, so now we have access to this guy, and it's not nil because we've configured it here in our show menu controller function, because we're in our container controller and we want to move that home controller over to the right. So now we can say self.centercontroller.frame, .view.frame.origin.x equals center controller.view.frame.width, and just go ahead and say -80. Okay. Okay, so that's going to show our menu. Let's see. We need a self in there. Okay, now when we want to hide our menu, we're going to just copy and paste this guy, and that's all going to be the same, except this is just now going to be 0. Okay, so now we need to call this function, and we want to call it in our handle menu toggle here, right? So we're going to say show menu controller, but we need to pass in a variable that is going to determine whether or not we're showing the menu or hiding the menu. So we need to go back up top to our properties and actually create another variable called isExpanded. And we're going to set that equal to false. So this is going to keep track of whether or not we're showing the menu or hiding the menu. And we set it equal to false because when we start the app, the menu is not showing, so isExpanded is false. So we're just going to pass in isExpanded here. Okay, so now we need a means of toggling this isExpanded variable back and forth between true and false so it accordingly shows or hides the menu. So what we need to do is go here and say isExpanded is equal to not isExpanded. And essentially this just, every time that button is pressed, it's going to change isExpanded to the opposite of what it was when we started out. So if it was true, it's going to get set to false. If it was false, it's going to get set to true, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that is taken care of. Now we can't forget that we need to add our menu controller in. And we want to add our menu controller when isExpanded is false. So we're going to say if isExpanded is false, then we're going to say configure menu controller. Then we're going to go down. We're going to set isExpanded to true. And then this show menu controller is going to say should expand true, and it's going to show our menu controller there. So let's go ahead and run this. And let's hit that. And it shows our menu controller. And we hit it and it hides our menu controller. So that's looking good there, guys. It's actually, let's actually make this duration 0.5. so it's a little cleaner. And now let's go ahead and start configuring out our menu controller. So go ahead and hop into menu controller, and we're actually going to create a table view for all of these options. It makes the handling a lot easier. We're going to use an enum to create a table view for these guys. We're going to set these images here and this description text, and then write out an action handler for when we click on an action, just like this. So let's go ahead and get started with that. So we're going to create a table view, UI table view, and down here we're going to say func configure table view, and we're going to say table view equals UI table view dot delegate equals self, table view dot data source equals self. Then we're going to go down here and write an extension, menu controller, UI table view delegate, UI table view data source. Then we're going to implement those methods. Number of rows in section, we can just say return 4. And then we need to create our table view cell. So let's go up to this our view class here, select new file, or view group, sorry. And we can actually do Cocoa Touch class for this one. There's not a lot of boilerplate code. Then we're going to say menu option cell. And this is going to be a UI table view cell. Okay. Create. So it's looking good. We actually don't need this code. Mark, properties, mark, init, mark, handlers. I do this every time I create a new file, guys. It's just good habit. So then type out init, and make sure you do this style and reuse identifier option. Then we're going to say super.init style reuse identifier, and it's going to ask us to implement a required initializer. Just go ahead and do that there. So this is our menu option cell. Now we can go back into our menu controller, and we can say let cell equal table view dot dequeue reusable cell for identifier. And we need to create this identifier. I always do it up at the top here. Private let reuse identifier equal menu option cell. Go back down. Just type out a reuse identifier for index path. Then we're going to say as menu option cell. And then we are going to return our cell. So that's our table view cell there. Hop back up to our configured table view guy, and we're going to say table view dot register cell class, and we're going to say menu cell dot self, or menu option cell dot self for reuse identifier. And I create that reuse identifier as a constant, so like these two guys line up, and you never have to worry about typing them both out as individual strings and spelling something wrong and screwing up your code. Okay guys, so that's going to do it for part 1. In the next video, we are going to get into adding our table view to this menu controller here. We're going to be doing that programmatically, so we'll see you in the next one, and thanks for watching.